The United States started from the East Coast. We no longer had our iron and steel in the South. We no longer had our main arable lands. The fascists overran our main coal source of the time, the Donbass. To go on fighting, to live until V-Day, it was necessary for us, in an unprecedentedly short time, to reorganize the national economy to suit the needs of war, to shift a considerable part of our industry to the east, and there, starting over quite often at zero level, to construct major war plants and other factories.
Создать там зачастую на голом месте крупнейшие оборонные заводы.
The main instrument of victory, over 95% of all types of armament and ammunition, was produced by our Soviet home front. Of course, we also pay tribute to those who helped us with weapons and equipment in the war years, to our allies. We render homage to the greatness of the immortal exploit of the workers of the home front. Of course, you remember only too well how in the summer of 1941, from the western regions of the Soviet Union, an endless stream of people, equipment, food, thousands of factories, millions and millions of people moved to the east.
To dismantle assembly lines, strip down the machines, load them into ships and trains, factory after factory, with the sound of the guns drawing nearer and nearer. Leonid Brezhnev was in charge of moving plants from part of the Ukraine. One important war plant in Leningrad was dismantled after the city had been surrounded and was rushed out of the city through a gauntlet of Nazi shell fire. The workers left Leningrad with the machines and were resettled in Siberia. They were back in almost full production in days. What could not be moved was destroyed, including the mammoth power plant and the Dnieper, the pride of Stalin's 5-year plan. Hundreds of major factories in hundreds of locations in Western Russia were packed up. And with them went the workers. That was the design. It was a design to save the Soviet Union's capacity to build the weapons that would preserve the nation. It was a design that had never been attempted before, and there was pain in it. In the vast migration, there was little rest, great loss, much uncertainty. When possible, art treasures were carried to safety. 1/3 of the invaluable Hermitage collection in Leningrad was shipped to the Urals. Tatiana Sokolova worked at the Hermitage in those days.
Если вы вспомните позу, в которой сидит Вольтер, опираясь на локотники своего...
You remember the statue of Voltaire. He's sitting in a chair with his hands resting on the arms. Imagine, if you will, when the statue was carried down the staircase, it started to sway. Voltaire seemed alive. It's unbelievable how alive he became. And with those sparkling eyes, he had a look that was so ironic, so mocking, that the stone seemed to come to life. He distinctly said, "Don't worry, I'll be back."
On the collective farms, the farm tools were driven across the fields for the last time to be transported to the virgin lands of the Soviet East. When there was time, the livestock was patiently herded to far-off pastures. approaching, they salvaged what they could. The rest they burned or buried to deny to the Germans. Statistics alone could not show what was lost and what was saved. The Soviet railroads were among the most extensive in Europe and crammed with rolling stock and locomotives. They were accustomed to moving masses of material. Harnessed to the war effort, the railroads were vital in the supply of troops to the front and the evacuation of civilians away from it. They were a prime target for the Germans. The Luftwaffe ranged along the tracks, bombing and strafing to create as much confusion as they could. Those tactics had worked well in the fall of France. Day after day, week after week, the Nazi bombers raked the odds. It was as perilous a battleground as the front line, and there could be no fighting back. Repair crews, truckers. Anyone whose duty lay in the freight yards was in mortal danger. Working in the open, they were absolutely defenseless. What the bombers accomplished in minutes, it took hours, days to clear. Fortunately, the Germans were as systematic as ever. They stuck to a rigid schedule. So trains could be diverted away from the target area and held until the attack was over. Rolled to their destinations. The Soviets had begun the war with an abundance of rolling stock. Now they had to husband it. Whatever the obstacles, the rail traffic had to get through. The railroads were Russia's arteries. While the wreckage still smoldered, the tracks east and west were cleared until the next attack. There was no time to test the damaged structures or the jerry-rigged substitutes. It was press through or die. For the train crews, every mile was a hazard as they traveled within range of the Nazi bombers. Closer to the front lines, the railroad men were even within reach of the German guns and any stray Nazi planes wandering the battlefield.